Money is not what we think it is. Not the coins, not the paper, not even the numbers on a screen. Those are symbols, and the system behind the symbols, the one we call modern finance, is surprisingly young. We are told the story of money begins simply: barter, then commodity exchange, then coins, then banks, a clean, progressive line from primitive trade to sophisticated markets. But there is a detail in that line that doesn't sit right. Across 3 continents, in civilizations that had no recorded contact with each other, you find the same structure, the same accounting logic, the same method of tracking obligation, debt, and value, not through coins, not through precious metals, but through systems so precise and so consistent that the only available explanation is that they were developed independently, simultaneously, with identical results. The question isn't whether these systems existed. They did. The evidence is physical. It is measurable. It still sits in museums and excavation sites today. The question is how civilizations with no documented contact arrived at the same financial logic, and why that question tends to go unanswered in the official record. The standard account of early currency begins in Mesopotamia, around 3000 BCE. We are told that Sumerian merchants began recording grain and silver transactions on clay tablets. These are accepted as the earliest documented financial instruments. Records of debt, trade agreements, loans with interest. The system is described as a local innovation, an organic response to the complexity of an agricultural economy that had outgrown simple barter. The tablets exist. They have been translated, studied, cataloged, thousands of them. The accounting detail is impressive: names, quantities, dates, rates of interest that map to roughly 20% annually. But here is where the official explanation quietly stops short. The same accounting architecture, structured debt, recorded obligations, standardized units of account, appears in the Indus Valley at roughly the same period. Not similar, structurally identical in its logic. The Indus Valley script remains undeciphered, which creates a convenient gap. We cannot confirm what the symbols mean, but the physical objects associated with that economy, standardized weights, precision-cut stones used for measurement, consistent ratios across hundreds of excavation sites from Harappa to Mohenjo-Daro, suggest a degree of financial standardization that should not coexist with the timeline of independent development. The official explanation accounts for Mesopotamian complexity, but not for the precision of the Indus Valley weight system appearing within the same historical window. These were not neighboring cultures. They were separated by geography, language, and, as far as the record indicates, by any documented exchange of institutional knowledge. The weight system at Mohenjo-Daro follows a binary sequence: 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, and then shifts to a decimal scale at higher values. That is not intuitive. It is not the kind of system a culture stumbles into. It is designed, and the design matches, in its underlying ratio logic, the systems appearing on the other side of the Persian plateau at the same time. This raises a straightforward technical problem. Either these 2 civilizations arrived at the same precise measurement logic through independent reasoning, or there was a shared source of that logic that has not been documented. Neither option is fully comfortable. What makes the Indus Valley case particularly difficult to dismiss is the sheer volume of consistent measurement artifacts recovered from its sites. Over 400 distinct settlements have been excavated across the Indus Valley region. Across all of them, the weight ratios remain stable. Not approximately stable, measurably, precisely stable, to a degree of accuracy that modern analysis has confirmed, requires both a standardized manufacturing process and a centralized authority capable of enforcing that standard across a geographic area of roughly 1 million square kilometers. That is larger than modern Pakistan. It is larger than Western Europe. No palace has been found at Mohenjo-Daro. No clear administrative center, no throne room, no military garrison, no visible seat of government. The city's layout is sophisticated: grid streets, covered drainage, public bath structures. But the institution behind the weight standardization has no identified physical location. The standard explanation offers several possibilities: a merchant class with shared conventions, a priestly authority, a distributed administrative network. All of these are plausible. None of them have been confirmed. What has been confirmed is the output of that institution. Weights that a modern laboratory can verify are consistent across 5 centuries and 1 million square kilometers. The institution that produced that output has not been found. Move the investigation forward by 2,000 years, and you encounter a different problem. Not similarity, but erasure. By approximately 600 BCE, coinage had emerged in Lydia, in what is now Western Turkey. The Lydians are credited with minting the first standardized metal coins from electrum, a naturally occurring alloy of gold and silver. This is treated as a clean origin point, the moment money became portable, standardized, and state-issued. But the archaeological record around the emergence of Lydian coinage contains a gap. Coinage does not appear gradually in Lydia. It appears fully formed. The earliest Lydian coins show a level of metallurgical control, consistent alloy ratios, precise weight standardization, uniform striking technique. That implies a period of development that does not show up in the archaeological record before the coins themselves. You would expect prototypes. You would expect variation. You would expect the physical evidence of a civilization figuring out how to do something for the first time. That evidence is largely absent. The official explanation attributes this to the difficulty of recovering early experimental coins, which are rare, and to the likelihood that many were melted down. This is reasonable as an explanation. It accounts for the absence. What it does not account for is the parallel emergence of standardized coinage in China and in India, within a narrow historical window, roughly the same 2 centuries, with no documented transmission of the concept between these regions. In China, bronze spade money and knife money appear by the 7th century BCE. In India, punch-marked silver coins emerge by the 6th century BCE. In the Aegean, electrum coins appear by the same period. 3 distinct regions, 3 distinct metals, 3 distinct aesthetic traditions, 1 shared institutional concept, a portable object of standardized weight whose value is guaranteed by the authority that issues it. The concept is not simple. It requires a political decision to back the object's value, a metallurgical capacity to standardize the object's composition, and a social agreement to accept the object as equivalent to real goods. All 3 conditions appear simultaneously across 3 disconnected civilizations. The standard explanation is convergent development, that similar economic pressures produce similar solutions. This is used frequently in archaeology to explain parallel emergence, and in some cases, it is a satisfying explanation. In this case, it requires accepting that 3 cultures with no shared documents, no shared language, and no recorded contact arrived at the same institutional concept within the same 2-century window. Convergence explains the logic of independent discovery. It struggles to explain the timing. There is a particular class of financial instrument that complicates the standard timeline even further. Not coins, not clay tablets, but tally sticks. Tally sticks are split pieces of wood, bone, or ivory on which numerical records were carved. The stick was then split down the middle, with 1/2 retained by each party to a transaction. The match between the 2 halves confirmed the record. The object could not be forged without both pieces, and the split made it tamper evident. The earliest surviving tally sticks date to roughly 30,000 BCE in Africa. The Ishango bone, found in what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo, is carved with the deliberate numerical notches and patterns that some researchers interpret as arithmetic sequences. The Lubumbo bone from Swaziland shows similar deliberate notation. These objects predate agriculture. They predate cities. They predate every civilization in the standard economic timeline by tens of thousands of years. The official position treats these objects as tallies of lunar cycles or hunting records or early mathematics. These are plausible interpretations. They may be correct, but the same tally system, split sticks used to record bilateral obligations, was still in official use in England until 1826. The British Exchequer used tally sticks as legal financial instruments for over 7 centuries. When the sticks were abolished and burned in 1834, the fire destroyed part of the Houses of Parliament. This is not a primitive curiosity. This is a financial technology that was trusted by one of the world's most sophisticated economies for 700 years, and its fundamental design, a split record that cannot be falsified, mirrors the structure of objects found across the same period in China, in the Ottoman Empire, and in pre-Columbian North America. The official explanation does not claim these uses were connected. It treats them as independent rediscoveries of an obvious solution. But if the solution is obvious, the question becomes why it required rediscovery. And if it is not obvious, if it is in fact a sophisticated anti-fraud mechanism requiring both conceptual and physical precision, then independent rediscovery becomes a more complex claim. The deeper pattern in the pre-modern financial record is not just the similarity of objects. It is the similarity of objects, specifically the logic of credit. We are taught that credit is a relatively modern concept, that early economies were primarily barter systems, and that credit only became possible once there were institutions capable of enforcing debt obligations. The archaeological record suggests this is inverted. David Graeber's analysis of the anthropological and archaeological literature on debt documented a consistent finding. Credit economies appear to predate coin economies. The tablets from are not records of commodity exchange. They are records of credit. They record what is owed, to whom, and at what rate of return. The physical evidence from Mesopotamia, from the Bronze Age Aegean, from pre-dynastic Egypt, consistently shows a credit structure that does not require coins or standardized currency. It requires only a trusted recording medium and a social institution capable of enforcing the record. This creates a quiet problem for the standard narrative of financial development. If credit is not a late development made possible by sophisticated institutions, but instead a primary form of exchange that predates those institutions, then the question of who designed the underlying logic of credit becomes more difficult to answer. Barter evolving into commodity money, evolving into credit, is a coherent story. It implies progressive development, but if credit appears before commodity money, then the development line is not progressive. It is different. And the story of money's origin requires a different explanation. The evidence doesn't disappear. The explanation does. There is a specific anomaly in the financial record of Mesopotamia that receives relatively little attention in standard economic history, and it concerns the precision of interest rates. The interest rate recorded on Sumerian loans from roughly 3000 to 2000 BCE is, with remarkable consistency, around 20% annually for silver loans and 33% for grain loans. These rates appear across hundreds of separate tablets, across centuries, with a consistency that implies either a regulatory institution or a shared convention of extraordinary durability. Modern economic historians generally attribute this to the mathematical convenience of these numbers in the sexagesimal system, the base 60 numerical system used by Sumerians, from which we still derive our 60-second minutes and 360-degree circles. 20% is a convenient fraction in base 60. This explanation accounts for the number. It does not account for the consistency of enforcement across multiple centuries, multiple city-states, and multiple political regimes. In modern economies, interest rates shift constantly. Central banks adjust them in response to economic conditions, political pressures, and market forces. The concept of a stable interest rate, maintained across centuries without a central banking authority, is, from the perspective of modern financial theory, unusual. And yet the tablets record exactly that. What kind of institution? And the question here is genuinely open, could enforce rate consistency across independent city-states, across changing political leadership, and across 2 millennia, without leaving a clear record of its own structure? The tablets record the transactions. The institution behind the consistency is not directly described. There is a parallel to this institutional invisibility in a different part of the ancient financial world, one that is less frequently examined. The temple economies of the ancient Near East functioned as something that modern analysis struggles to categorize cleanly. Temples in Sumer and Egypt and in the Hittite Empire were not simply religious institutions. They were financial centers. They held grain reserves that functioned as capital. They issued loans. They maintained accounts. They employed scribes whose primary function was financial record-keeping, not liturgical documentation. In some periods of Mesopotamian history, the temple was the primary institution through which credit flowed. Merchants operating at long distances obtained silver from temple treasuries, conducted their trade, and returned with profit. The contracts governing these arrangements survive on tablets. The interest rates, again, fall within the established range. What this suggests is that the stability of Mesopotamian interest rates may not have required enforcement across political regimes in the way a modern central bank would operate. It may have been maintained through the continuity of temple institutions, which outlasted individual city-states and political rulers. If that is the case, then the temple system was functioning as a proto-central bank, not in its political structure, but in its economic function, for a period of at least 2,000 years before anything comparable appears in the modern record. This is not a fringe interpretation. It appears in the academic literature on ancient Near Eastern economics. What it does not appear in with much regularity is the mainstream narrative of how banking began. The standard account of banking's origins places the first recognizable banks in medieval Italy, the Medici, the money changers of Florence and Venice, the temple economy of Mesopotamia, which performed structurally similar functions 2,000 years earlier, is typically described as a precursor rather than an equivalent. The distinction may be more semantic than substantive, but semantic distinctions shape what questions get asked. And when the temple economy is categorized as a precursor rather than a banking system, the question of how its financial logic was transmitted, or whether it was lost and independently rediscovered, tends not to be raised. The question of financial knowledge transmission becomes most acute when you look at the pre-Columbian Americas. The Aztec and Inca economies developed financial instruments that have structural parallels with systems in the Old World. Cacao beans in Mesoamerica functioned as currency, standardized, portable, difficult to counterfeit in sufficient quantity. The Aztec tributary system maintained accounting records of extraordinary complexity across a geographic area spanning modern Mexico and Central America. The Inca financial system is more unusual. The quipu, a device made of knotted cords, record numerical data across a decimal system. Quipus were used for census data, tax records, tribute accounting, and military logistics. Modern analysis of surviving quipus has decoded the numerical system and confirmed that it operated on a consistent positional logic, not type, not position, and chord color all carried distinct informational values. The parallel with Old World accounting structures is not in the physical form, which is unique, but in the institutional logic, a state using a standardized recording medium to track obligations across a large and complex population. The standard explanation treats this as convergent development. Two economic pressures, two independent solutions. But here the timing again introduces a problem. The Inca administrative quipu system appears in the archaeological record in its sophisticated form, already highly developed, in the period before significant Inca imperial expansion. There is limited evidence of a developmental stage during which the system was being refined. It appears, as with Lydian coinage, with a maturity that does not clearly match the timeline of its apparent origin. The official explanation for this is limited archaeological preservation. The Andes are not ideal for preserving organic material, and earlier developmental examples may simply not have survived. This is a reasonable answer. It is also a recurring answer. Across the financial anomalies examined here, the simultaneous emergence of credit systems, the parallel development of coinage, the consistency of interest rates, the sophistication of accounting devices, the official explanation frequently appeals to preservation gaps, missing records, missing prototypes, missing transitional stages. Each individual gap is explainable. The pattern of gaps is harder to explain. Here is one more category of evidence that deserves close examination: the sudden disappearance of financial sophistication. The Bronze Age collapse, which occurred roughly between 1200 and 1150 BCE, is one of the least explained events in ancient economic history. Within a period of approximately 50 years, the interconnected palace economies of the Eastern Mediterranean, Mycenae, Hattusa, Ugarit, the Egyptian Empire in the Levant, collapsed, not declined. Collapsed. Many sites were abandoned and not rebuilt. With the collapse went the administrative infrastructure of these economies. The linear bead tablets that recorded Mycenaean financial transactions, inventories, tribute records, land allocations, disappeared. The scribal class that maintained this record-keeping was not replaced in Greece for approximately 4 centuries. This period, the Greek Dark Ages, is characterized in part by the absence of writing. 4 centuries without writing. In a culture that had used writing for financial record-keeping for at least 5 centuries before the collapse. When writing reemerges in Greece in the 8th century BCE with the adoption of the Phoenician alphabet, the financial institutions of the preceding palace economy do not reemerge with it. The palace economy, with its centralized redistribution system and its sophisticated record-keeping, is replaced over time with something structurally different. This is not simply a political transition. It represents a discontinuity in financial knowledge, not just records, but the institutional logic embedded in those records. The knowledge did not pass down. Or if it did, it passed through channels that have not been identified. And here, the investigation intersects with a broader problem in the historical record. The assumption built into standard financial history is that knowledge accumulates, that each generation builds on the last, that the line of development, however interrupted, is generally forward. The Bronze Age collapse suggests that is not always true. Complex financial systems can disappear. The institutions that generated and maintained them can cease to exist. And when the next civilization tries to rebuild, it begins, or appears to begin, again from a simpler starting point. What is particularly notable about the post-collapse recovery period is how long it took for comparable financial complexity to re-emerge, and how different the new system was when it did. The palace redistribution economy of the Mycenaean world, in which a central authority collected, recorded, and redistributed goods across a managed network, was not rebuilt. What replaced it, centuries later, was a market economy based on coinage and private contract, two entirely different financial architectures. The second did not grow from the first. It developed in the absence of the first, after a gap long enough that institutional memory of the earlier system was effectively gone. This suggests that financial architecture is not inevitable. It is not something that simply emerges when a society reaches sufficient complexity. It is something that must be built, maintained, and transmitted. And when transmission fails, the architecture does not naturally re-emerge in the same form. That finding, if taken seriously, changes how the earlier parallels should be read. If financial architecture requires active transmission to survive, then the identical logic appearing across disconnected civilizations is not evidence of independent invention. It is evidence of a transmission pathway that has not been identified. This raises a possibility that the official record does not directly address, because the record is constructed from what survived, not from what existed. We know that the ancient world had long-distance trade networks. The Uluburun shipwreck, a late Bronze Age vessel discovered off the coast of Turkey and dated to approximately 1300 BCE, contained cargo from at least 7 different cultures: Egyptian, Canaanite, Mycenaean, Kassite, Babylonian, Cypriot, and 2 others. The ship was not an anomaly. It was one ship from what must have been a regular network. That network required financial infrastructure. It required contracts, credit arrangements, standardized units of value, and some form of trusted documentation. The ship's cargo was too diverse and too valuable to represent casual trade. The financial instruments that structured this network are largely absent from the record. Organic materials, papyrus documents, perishable ledgers, these would not survive. What survives is the cargo. The administrative infrastructure behind that cargo is reconstructed by inference. When inference is the primary tool, the picture that emerges is shaped by what the investigator expects to find. And the expectation, built into mainstream economic history, is that Bronze Age trade was less sophisticated than modern trade, that it operated through simpler mechanisms. The ship suggests otherwise. The weight of its cargo, the diversity of its origins, and the geographic range of its distribution implies a level of logistical coordination that requires financial instruments we cannot currently account for. The instruments may have existed, the record of them does not. What is left then, when the gaps and the parallels and the disappearances are placed alongside each other? Not a conspiracy, not a suppressed alternative history. Those framings replace one set of assumptions with another. What is left is a structural problem in the official account of how financial knowledge developed. The account requires us to accept that identical institutional logic emerged independently across disconnected civilizations within narrow historical windows. It requires us to accept that sophisticated systems appeared without clear developmental stages, and that the absence of those stages is explained by preservation failure. It requires us to accept that complex financial infrastructure was lost multiple times throughout history, without that loss being treated as evidence that the infrastructure was more developed than currently estimated. Each acceptance is individually defensible. Together, they construct an explanation that works by eliminating what doesn't fit, rather than by accounting for it. The weight system at Mohenjo-Daro still exists. Its ratios are still measurable. The precision that went into its construction is not in question. What remains in question is who had the institutional knowledge to design that system, and where that knowledge came from, because the civilization that produced it appeared with that knowledge apparently intact, maintained it for centuries, and then disappeared without leaving a clear record of how the knowledge was acquired. The same is true of the credit logic embedded in the Sumerian tablets. The same is true of the tally stick's structural elegance. The same is true of the Quipru's positional mathematics. These systems did not require metal. They did not require complex machinery. They required a specific kind of institutional knowledge. The understanding that value is a recorded obligation, that debt and credit are 2 sides of the same entry, and that the medium of recording is less important than the social agreement to honor it. That understanding appears repeatedly across cultures and centuries in forms that are too consistent to be coincidental and too isolated to be easily explained by transmission. The standard explanation for this pattern is that similar problems produce similar solutions, that human cognition, given the same pressures, tends toward the same answers. This may be correct. It may also be that the pattern reflects something the current historical model is not equipped to describe. A layer of financial knowledge that predates the civilizations that used it, moving through channels that left no surviving documentation. The tablets still record the transactions. The institution that standardized the rate across 20 centuries of Mesopotamian trade has not been identified. The tally sticks still survive in museum collections. The principle they encode in, an unforgeable bilateral record, is still used in cryptographic security systems today. The quipus are still being decoded. Each new analysis reveals additional layers of informational structure in objects dismissed for centuries as primitive counting devices. The evidence does not point in one direction. It does not resolve into a single alternative narrative. What it does, consistently, is resist the tidiness of the official account. Financial knowledge, at multiple points in the historical record, appears more developed than the timeline permits, more consistent than independent development explains, and more fragile than its apparent sophistication would suggest. The system existed, in multiple forms, across multiple civilizations. Before the history of money is officially said to begin, what that system was built on, what foundational knowledge structured the credit logic, the weight ratios, the obligation recording across cultures that had no documented contact, remains, in the current record, without an answer. The objects survive. The knowledge behind them does not.